The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
No Child Left Behind was the Bush administration's massive attempt to improve American public education. How realistic is its goal of all children from every racial and ethnic group to be proficient in reading and math by 2014? Is No Child Left Behind's approach to federally mandated high-stakes testing and state standard setting a practical solution for raising the achievement of American students? Joining us to discuss No Child Left Behind and the future of American education is Chester Finn, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. And now, Doug Besheroff.
Checker Finn.
Greetings.
Welcome back to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here again.
Yes, delighted. We've been talking about your book, Troublemaker, A Personal History of School Reform Since Sputnik. And I'm not going to ask you any personal questions, but I want to move the conversation a little further on. And I'm trying to understand, how do we measure, how do we know what young people should know or need to know for the 21st century, say, since we're in it?
It's not a science, unfortunately. If it were a science, it would be so much easier to deal with this issue. It's a subjective judgment about what should kids know. And the closest it's come to science has been a pretty sophisticated group asking a bunch of college professors who teach freshmen and a bunch of employers who hire high school graduates, what skills do they want their new arrivals to possess? And there's been some effort to triangulate that with what states have been saying 12th graders ought to know in order to graduate from high school. And there's some momentum in that exercise. In fact, the groups that have been doing it are about to do it all over again, attempting to get some kind of international benchmarking. So the effort to anchor this in the real world has been an effort to use college professors and employers as a reference point. Beyond that, it's subjective. It's, is it important to know history? Well, why? Is it important to study art? Well, why? And which kinds of art and how much? And do you want art history, or do you want to know how to make a clay sculpture? Two different versions of art. Do you want to play a flutophone, or do you want to know who Beethoven was? These are in the U.S. typically entrusted to vast committees appointed by state departments of education that prescribe what we call state standards in various subjects for the kids of the entire state.
Now, you and I both have children who went to Montgomery County schools, or at least schools located in Montgomery County, and you may remember that our children had to learn all the Lord Calverts by state law.
Texas kids have to learn Texas history by state law.
There you are. So there is a precedent for all this.
Oh, it's been going on this way for a long time. Actually, what's new, starting in the 80s, has been the existence of statewide uniform standards. They're not very good in most states. My organization, the Fordham Institute, has been evaluating state standards for 12 years now, and we're pretty disgruntled by most of what we find in most states in most subjects, which is to say even their aspirational statements of what kids ought to know are not good. And then you get to the question of, is anything like that delivered? Does that list of aspirational knowledge and skills translate into curriculum, instruction, teacher preparation, textbooks, all the moving parts that it has to translate into for it to have any chance of actually being learned?
And so let's go to the actually being learned. A few years ago, you wrote a book, I think with Diane Ravage, that basically said what kids don't know. So without going through all that, without doing that from memory, what are the big things that the average middle-class kid doesn't know? And I don't necessarily mean when the Civil War was, but what's the shape of their educational attainment by the time they get out of high school?
Well, they don't know when the Civil War was. There's that. Their reading skills are, let's let's set aside the sort of advanced placement crowd, because we actually do a not bad job for 5 or 10% of our population at the upper end of high schools who then go on to selective colleges. That's not the group I'm worried about. But the huge number of other kids are coming out with weak reading skills, very little knowledge of literature, mediocre math skills, usually not even at the level of Algebra 2, much less anything beyond that, paltry knowledge of geography, history, and civics, and rudimentary science, usually at the level of what we used to call general science, a kind of 9th grade survey course, rather than usable biology, chemistry, and physics. Additionally, many of them lack kind of modern technology. They know how to use their own computers, but they don't know how to do anything constructive with their computer, like look up the information you might need to explain something to somebody.
Really? Even in this time of Google and...
I mean, they can get to Wikipedia. I mean, they can do that. But and if you're willing to settle for a Wikipedia explanation of something, then yes, sure. But if you want somebody to be able to do a science project or to write a history paper on, why Charles I lost his head, or for that matter, why Bill Clinton got in trouble with the Congress, we want more sophisticated investigative skills than most young people are getting.
Now that sounds a little bit like the ability to do logical reasoning.
And combine it with information. There's this eternal divide in education between skills and knowledge, between whether just knowing how to think is enough or whether you also need a lot of facts at your disposal. And there's a kind of craziness at each extreme. There's a kind of memorize lists at one extreme and not know how to do anything with that information. And at the other extreme, there's the you can always look it up crowd who don't think anybody needs to actually know anything, including what is 7 times 6, because after all, you've got a calculator. In between, which is where we ought to be, is a merger of knowledge and skills, both thinking skills, but also application skills.
How much of that is cultural? Where I teach now, we have a fair number of students from other countries, whether from Asia or from Europe. And they don't seem to be particularly introspective. I mean, they're smart, they're hardworking, they can do all the math problems you can think of, and I'm sure they can read in their native language just fine. They're not that good in English, but they lack that ability, whatever that intellect is, to synthesize information and present it.
Yes.
How much of this is cultural?
Some of it actually isn't cultural. It's the way those countries' education systems work. I was in some schools in Bangalore, India the other week, and kids were learning English in that they could read you an English sentence. But then you ask them a question about a word or concept in that sentence, and they had no idea. They were learning only the most superficial decoding skill that would enable them to read a sentence aloud, but they had no understanding at all of what was going on in that sentence or that paragraph or whatever. That was the school's curriculum as mandated in this instance by the state of Andhra Pradesh, which only tests in the end that simple skill. And that's all you need to graduate, so to speak.
Coming back to the U.S., we've been talking about the middle class. But I think one of the things that has motivated some of the school reform, at least under No Child Left Behind, and let's remember the phrase is No Child Left Behind, which is a signal of worrying about everybody, including the poor, the racial minorities, immigrants, and so forth. And there's a body of literature that says that those young people are even further behind.
Correct.
How much further behind?
Well, the classic illustration is that a black 8th grader knows about what a white 4th grader knows, and a poor 12th grader knows about what a middle-class 8th grader knows. In other words, there's a, let's say, 4 grade levels lag.
And do they ever catch up?
Never. Except there are some schools where there's evidence that they are catching up.
But first, just to kind of lock in what this is. The white 4th grader is going to become a white 8th grader, is going to become a white whatever.
12th grader become a white college graduate.
And the black 8th grader who is at the 4th grade level may never get beyond the 4th grade?
Well, right. Will get physically into high school and won't complete high school, or if completes high school, won't go to college, or if goes to college, will fall out of college within the first year or two, and will never get the kind of job that, or career path that you would wish them to have the chance to raise a family on and learn to be a voter on and earn a decent living at.
Now, this is a giant issue. Now, you mentioned and I mentioned African Americans. Latinos, slightly different story, no?
But the achievement scores are not much higher. If you look at national assessment results for Latino American kids, which is of course a larger population now than African American kids, they're a little higher. They're a quarter of the way from black to white.
How much of that is just English as a second language?
I don't know. I do not know. It depends on the rules for test taking and all that, and special accommodations, and of course it varies some by subject. That's more of an issue with English testing, for example, reading testing than math.
Yeah, I've seen studies from the Pew Hispanic Center, and that such a large number of Hispanic children come here, as 8, 9, 10, and 12, and 13-year-olds, and they're counted in that same pool. And if you look at the younger Latinos who come at 1 or 2, the picture is different. I wonder if it's a compositional issue. It's just always important to learn these things, I guess.
It's a good question.
So, you wanted to mention before, and I cut you off. So there are schools doing better for these kids.
There's some superstar schools.
What are those schools like? Who are they? What do they do?
Many of them are charter schools, which are free from a lot of the rules and constraints on school days and teacher hours and things like that. It's harder to find them within districts because of all the all the rules and sort of uniformities that are enforced in district schools. But the standout schools that are doing a good job with poor and minority kids are typically places that run very long days and weeks and years, so the number of instructional hours is hugely expanded over what we're used to. The teachers are on duty pretty much 24/7. The kids have their cell phone numbers. Call them for help with their homework at 10 o'clock at night. The culture is very much one of, I am going to college. I am graduating from high school. In some of these schools, even when the school ends with 8th grade, they're regarded, if you're an 8th grader in 2010, the school treats you as a member of the class of 2014 because they treat you as a high school graduate, as a future high school graduate from the day you arrive.
Trying to create those expectations.
Expectations. The culture is, frankly, a middle-class culture of aspiration and achievement. And one of the things the school does is occupy so much of the kid's life that he doesn't have much time to go back to the street culture.
And these are the KIPs?
KIP is probably the best-known brand name right now. But there are several more of these chains, these franchise operations.
Some are for profit.
Some are for profit, though the ones I've seen the best results in happen not to be for profit. But in the brave new world of American schools, with 4,000 charter schools the last time I looked, there's a very interesting blend. Some bad schools, some mediocre, and some good schools. But within the good schools, some are for profit, some are nonprofit, some are college bound, some are this way and that way. But sticking with the model that seems to be making a difference in the lives of poor kids in an academic sense, whether it's KIP or the Achievement First or the Academy of the Pacific Rim in Boston, there's a bunch of these, hundreds, not thousands.
I hope they deliberately chose the phrase Pacific Rim, unless I have my geography wrong.
They did. They started in Boston's Chinatown with a bunch of Asian immigrants who said, why can we not have for our kids in Boston the kind of school we had in our native land? Academy of the Pacific Rim in Roxbury, in Jamaica Plain, I think, in Boston.
So these schools, is more expectation, higher dosage of education,
yes.
Right?
Yeah, a very coherent curriculum and instructional plan, and very strong discipline. And quite a lot of parent involvement. The parents, in effect, have to buy into the school's model and agree that their kid is going to be there every day, et cetera. There's a lot of behavior modification work going on in these schools.
And better teachers?
Young, eager teachers willing to give their all. One of the unanswered questions is how sustainable is this model, or does it lead to teacher burnout that cannot be sustained?
Now, all of this, however, because as I understand it, these charter schools, you have to volunteer to go in them. So you have this.
Schools of choice.
So, how many social workers does it take to change a light bulb? One, but you need a light bulb who wants to change. In effect, without using the word creaming, you are dealing with folks who want a better chance in life. So in some respects, it's a more motivated group of students and parents.
And they've got to be willing to sacrifice the extra days, for example, the extra time not having the kid home to babysit the younger kids because the kid's in school till 5:30 instead of getting home at 3. Yeah, their families do have to buy into this model and be willing to make the sacrifices and to do that. So yes, the worst off families aren't going to do this. They're not organized enough. They're not together enough. But surprisingly far down the spectrum, I think these schools can work.
I think that's right from what I've seen. But that does give rise to the complaint on the other side, whether it's from the teachers' unions or whoever. And I know they're largely supportive of charter schools in one form or another. Yeah, that's why I put it that way. Yeah,
sort of.
But that does give rise to the claim, well, this is creaming, and those who are left behind
Yeah,
are just going to be further left behind.
Balderdash. I mean, you can't make social policy by trying to calibrate everything to the worst imaginable case. Or you'll be left with dealing with kids that no public policy institution is capable of solving all the problems of. And if we say that the only test of an effective school is can it deal with the low ability, new immigrant, disabled kid.
Careful, you are now citing the rules of No Child Left Behind.
And one of the sins of No Child Left Behind. And one of the areas where they've had to make exceptions already. For example, roughly 3% of the kids have been exempted from the test side of No Child Left Behind on grounds of disability. They're beginning to exempt new immigrants, at least for a period of time, because they've actually had to accommodate to reality up to a point. So it's no longer no child left behind. But picture a politician, picture an American politician passing a law saying 20% of kids left behind. Even though 80% proficiency would be an enormous accomplishment for the United States. By my definition of proficiency, we're around 30% today.
Well, it's an interesting question. One thing that's striking to me about Barack Obama is he has the ability to say that thing without quite putting the 20% number there. And I don't mean this to be an advertisement about him, but about political rhetoric. I think there are ways to say those kinds of things if you're of a mind to try.
I agree. He could. There are ways to say them. And whether he will, who knows? We wish him well.
Yeah. So we have this set of schools.
Yes.
And let's say they're doing fabulously,
Yes.
the KIPP academies and whatever. And we have the public school system. How's it doing? Now, you've been pretty critical, but is it getting...
Flat.
Are things getting better?
Flat.
Flat.
The big story of the last 30 years is flat achievement, flat graduation, the rest of the world doing better.
Now, looking at New York City, where I think they doubled the per pupil spending in 6 years or whatever, you can hardly notice the change. They always point to these increases, but they look from a distance to be very small changes.
Well, they've hired more people and they've paid them more money to do more or less the same thing.
Well, now let's get to that. So let's assume change is good. All right, this is the American
Even
people.
necessary.
People have seemed to say that. And let's assume for a moment, I'll ask you at the end what change should be, but let's assume change is necessary. The classrooms I visit look almost exactly like the classrooms that I grew up in. I think the teachers are a little better looking, but that could just be, but it's still, the door closes, and it's this one teacher, and whether it's 15 or 20 or 40 students, and there you go. Has much changed in the classroom, and what will it take to change what's happening?
Well, the big change that's coming, actually, is technology is beginning to invade not just the classroom, but the out of classroom. And the cyber schools that are beginning to proliferate around the country are a very interesting alternative educational model entirely. And I think this is an unstoppable change because it's happening in every sector of our life. It will penetrate into the regular brick and mortar school classroom last, but it's already penetrating into the lives of the kids, and it's penetrating into what they're learning outside of school, and it's penetrating into the ability of parents to buy or obtain non-traditional education for kids if they want it. I mean, the Ohio Virtual Charter School today enrolls 5,000 kids who do not set foot in a brick and mortar school.
Wow.
But they're going to a school that is subject to state standards, state tests. It's just they do most of their learning at home. That's a big change, and it's going to be the big change of the next quarter century, I think. In terms of
now, let's stay with the technology for a minute. Is that because of technology's promise, or because it's less expensive per unit of education? Your former boss, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, I think he used to draw the analogy to a symphony orchestra, who said, "Did you ever wonder why the price of music doesn't go down? We do it the way we used to do it in the 16th or 17th century." And I think he said the same thing about education.
Well, it's not true, in that you can also, symphony orchestras get more productive when they start going on television and recording CDs and speaking to a much wider audience than just people in the symphony hall. Teachers can teach tens of thousands of kids at the same time if we were willing to organize our system that way.
So this is as much a money issue.
It's both. I mean, so far the providers of these technology schools, these cyber schools, have not wanted to acknowledge that it could be cheaper, because most of them involve for-profit operators that want the same per pupil payment as the traditional brick and mortar school. Well, that's a marketing ploy. And in a time of tight budgets, I actually have even recommended to some of these companies that they'd get farther if they would admit that they could do it for 80% of the price of a regular traditional brick and mortar school. So far, they're not taking my advice.
So technology, and I interrupted you. What else?
Your point about the closed door is pretty much the same as it was, is about right. The biggest difference is that the classes are smaller today than they were when you were a kid in school. When you were a kid in school, the crude ratio of kids to teachers in American schools was 27 to 1. Today it's 15 to 1. Doesn't mean the classes are 15 kids. It does, however, mean there is one person employed as a teacher for every 15 kids. And that's an enormous change in staffing. It's why we have a more than 3 million person teacher workforce today. And it's fundamentally why we've spent so much more money on education without paying teachers better salaries.
Now, has anyone ever done an experiment to see whether dividing that 30 students with 2 teachers or mixing them with 90? Have we ever done careful, rigorous research about all this?
Not careful and rigorous. There's a lot of sort of partial evidence, though, that a really good teacher with more kids produces better results than mediocre teachers with fewer kids. And that the trade-off we've made, smaller classes as the sort of coin of the realm here, has been a mistake. But you can understand why it happened. Parents believe in small classes, and teachers believe in small classes. And there's been no pushback against small classes. So we have smaller classes, 3 million teachers, and teachers whose pay is not all that great.
Well, we have 2 or 3 minutes left.
All right.
And I promised you that I would ask you, if you were monarch, how would you like to see education policy go in the next decade or 2?
Well, there's no one waving of the wand that will do it. This is a big, complex system, and it's got a lot of things that need to change at the same time. But I'd have a lot more high-quality choices for families to make among schools. I would not allow large bureaucracies to run cookie-cutter schools that people are assigned to more or less against their will. I would have a national standards and tests combined with enormous amount of school-level freedom to innovate and differentiate in every other way besides the national standards and tests. In other words, how it's taught, how it's delivered, how the school is organized, what its calendar is, how its resources are deployed. All that would be in the hands of the principal, who would also be in charge of who works in the school and would have total control over the workforce in that school, just as parents would have total control over which school their kids go to. And the system as a whole would have total transparency with regard to which schools were better than which according to those national standards and tests. Additionally, you'd have these technology options both out of school and in school, so that if your school wasn't teaching something, you could just dial it up on a URL and order the supplemental materials over the internet, and you could produce that art class for your kid at home or at the art center down the street that the school isn't doing.
Well, I wish we had another 30 minutes, because I would then ask you to explain how we get from here to there.
Elect me monarch.
Well, there you are. The job is yours. Checker Finn, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.